Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third session in American English Live Teacher Development Series 5. My name is Lauren, and I'll be with you today along with my colleague behind the scenes, Heather, who will be serving as moderator to help answer your questions and respond to your comments during this session. Today, our host, Kate, will be talking with our presenter, Dan Ryder, about comic book creation as a tool for English language learners to develop critical thinking skills. So let's get started.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our third session in the fifth series of American English Live for Teacher Development. My name is Kate, and as always, I'm very happy to be your host and facilitator today. We're excited for a great session today on creating comics to think critically, and we're so happy to see everyone here, so welcome. Let's start with these great photos featuring teachers from the American Corner Pristina viewing group. We love to see teachers learning together in viewing groups or using ideas that they've learned in one of our webinars in their classrooms. So please share your photos by emailing americanenglishwebinars@elprograms.org or by tagging us on social media. If you post them on social media, make sure that you tag them at American English for Educators so that we can see them and share them hopefully in one of our next sessions. Today, we'll explore creating comics to think critically, and later in the series, we're going to focus on learner motivation. We look forward to learning with you and hope you will be able to use the practical information and strategies discussed here in your classrooms. Which topics are you most interested about? Please share your ideas in the comments or chat. So here's a little bit about what to expect. Each session is approximately 60 minutes long and is often related to an American English eTeacher Massive Open online course or a Teacher's Corner theme on the American English website or American English social media channels. The presenter will present the material and I, as your host, will ask questions and make comments too. But we really hope to hear from you, our audience, so that we can address your questions, comments, context, ideas, and experiences. So please use the comment and chat box so that we can hear from you. When our session comes to a close in about an hour, you will receive an opportunity to get a digital badge. At the end of the session, we'll share a link in the comments and at the top of this post. Click on that link and complete a short quiz about today's session. You must answer 2 out of 3 multiple choice questions correctly, and once you've successfully completed that quiz, you should expect to receive your digital badge via email within about a week. Comic books are a pleasure to read, but they can also be a great resource in the English classroom. This month in the Teacher's Corner, learn more about comic books and find different classroom activities that use comic books to help with language learning. Visit the link here on the slide for more information. And now for today's session, Creating Comics to Think Critically. During this presentation, we will learn how comics tell stories and ways in which comic readers process information. We'll explore how learners can make their own comics to demonstrate problem solving and communication skills. We'll consider how learners can create memoirs and nonfiction. And we'll address how educators can take advantage of the link between great fiction and comics. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our presenter for today, Dan Ryder. Dan is the Success and Innovation Center Director at the Mount Blue campus in Farmington, Maine, where he has taught for 20 years. Co-author of 2017's Intention, Critical Creativity in the Classroom, he presents his work on critical creativity and empathy-fueled problem solving all over the United States. Dan is an Apple Distinguished Educator and recipient of the National Education Association Foundation's Horace Mann Award for Teaching Excellence. His recent work for the U.S. Department of State's Office of English Language Programs includes developing a comic book to support educators using comic creation as a tool for critical thinking and language acquisition. So welcome, Dan. We're so happy to have you here today.
Hi there.
Hello.
Sorry, had a little glitch on my end. I turned myself off and turned myself on, and we're back. Okay.
Welcome. Thanks for being here, Dan.
I'm,
We're happy to have you.
I'm thrilled to be here. This is super fun. I love comic books. I love teaching with comic books. I love learning through comics. So I cannot express appreciation enough for being able to share this all with you today. So let's get started, shall we?
Sounds great.
Dive right in. So in this session, we're going to be talking about four things, basically. We're going to talk about how we experience comic books and the different ways that comic books surface in our lives and our experience that we've had with both reading and creating them ourselves. We're going to talk in part 2 about how comic books work. And then in part 3, we're going to focus on how to make comic books and all the different ways that you could do that. And finally, in part 4, I'm going to share 3 different takeaways that you could use tomorrow with your students or even later today, depending on where you are, that you could do with your kids, Sorry, I refer to my students as my kids all the time because they're actually kids. And so sometimes I have to get out of that habit where you can talk to your students about how to think with comic books.
Sounds great.
So, let's talk a little bit about our experiences with comic books. And I have a question for you all coming right up on the next slide. How might you find out what your students already know about comic books and about making comics?
Great. Yeah. What do you think, everybody? How do you find out about your students' interests and ideas? And especially in this case, related to comics. So how would you ask your students, or what would you do to find out what your students already know about making comics? What do you think? Let's see. Oh, Iram says they also refer to their students as kids. So you're not alone, don't worry. Let's see, Hina Enam says by making different characters in their notebook, maybe they could draw pictures of what they already know. Abir says they could do some brainstorming. Let's see. They could talk about their favorite ones from Laura. Arno says they can talk about the latest Marvel stories. Great idea.
Love it.
Maybe just take a comic book and show it to them and ask them what vocabulary they already know. Or Brian says looking at their first impressions when given a first comic strip. So these are all great ideas. What do you think, Dan?
Those are fantastic ideas. Fantastic ideas. So I want to share a strategy that I use with my students that some of you might have seen used before, but not necessarily when it comes to making comics. And this is called a KWL chart. It's kind of a classic literacy strategy that we use to help students activate their prior knowledge. So what you would do in a KWL chart is you go through these 3 steps. In step 1, students would make a list of what they already know on a chart. And in step 2, the students would list what they want to know about a particular subject or topic. And then in step 3, students would think about what they've done during the lesson and talk about what they've learned and what they've taken away from the lesson, and to see whether or not they've learned what they were hoping to learn in their list in step 2. If we go to the next slide, you can kind of see how this would work with comics. So you might ask them to start with, what do you know about making comics? And there's just some things that a student might list. They might know about superheroes, and they might know that there are word balloons, and they might know there's lots of movies made about them. They might know the character Tintin or Asterisk or one of these kind of famous characters. In step 2, you find out what they want to know. And a lot of questions that I get when I'm working with students and comics is, are cartoons and comics the same thing? Do you read the words or the pictures first? That's a classic. It happens all the time. Mm-hmm. Sometimes they want to know if there are comics about particular subject areas, or particular topics that they're really passionate about. And then when you get to the end, what you're hoping is that they've learned what you wanted them to learn, right? So like for today, I'm hoping that you're going to learn that anyone can make comics. I'm hoping you learn that making comics helps us to be better problem solvers. And I'm also hoping that you learn that making comics is a great way to help us learn language.
Sounds good.
So that's just one strategy that I really like to use. That's the KWL. If we go to the next slide, another great strategy is one that I like to use called timeline. And what I do with timeline is I ask students to brainstorm and reflect on their experiences with a particular topic or subject.
Riley, please report to
Oh, you hear that? I'm in my actual high school where classes are actually going on right now as we're doing this great webinar. So apologies if we get some announcements and some interruptions over the space of our time together today.
I'm sure lots of teachers are in the same situation. They're hearing announcements too as they're watching this webinar. So,
Right.
No worries.
So then step 2, what you would do is you take all those experiences that they know, and then they put them in chronological order of when they experienced them. And it's to kind of take them back into when they learned that subject, when they learned those ideas, those skills, and to take them into those contexts of remembering the process of learning that. And you can see an example here on my next slides. This is a comic book timeline of myself, right? I started reading comics when I was 6, and at the time I wanted to, become a creator at some point. And as I progressed through time, I started reading more superhero comics and more mature comics, historical comics. And now at this ripe old age of 42, I read comics of all types. And I'm actually getting to live my dream of publishing a comic. And I'm doing it right here with American English. We're going to be coming out with a comic book that my friend Josh Alves and I have put together. It's almost done, and it should be out by the end of the year. Fingers crossed. Fingers crossed.
Attention to that on the American English website and on our social media channels. Stay tuned for an awesome new comic book that our presenter Dan is working on.
And you're going to see a whole bunch of illustrations from it today. Actually, you've seen a few already, but there's going to be some illustrations from the comic right here in our webinar.
Great.
So if we go to the next slide here. Okay, so what are some of your experiences that you've had with comic books? Let's think a little more about this experience from us as educators and when we were growing up, or even what we experience right now. What are some of your experiences? I'd really like to know so I can connect with some of you around those ideas.
Wonderful. Yeah, so let us know, everybody, what are your experiences with comic books? You can say 0 experience. You can say I've been reading them my whole life. You can say I'm just starting to use them in my classroom. Whatever your experiences are, let us know. Let's see, Rahila Akhtar says she loves reading comics in newspapers. Great. HP says that they use it in language classes and they find it very interesting and enjoyable. Awesome. Mahad Jabin also says comic books are very interesting. What else, everyone? What is your experience? Did you grow up reading comics? Is it something new for you? Let's see, Laura Calderon says, I used to read them as a child, but I don't have any experience with them as a teacher. Very nice. Let's see.
I think that was a great comment about the newspaper. That's how I started reading comics really when growing up. And I still remember, I can still picture the milk ring from my cereal bowl around where I set my bowl down, and little dribbles of milk would go around, and I'd be reading the comic strips there at the kitchen table.
Great.
These are awesome.
Aisha says she enjoys guessing the hidden message in comic books. Awesome. Yen says, I stopped reading them a few years ago and I haven't used them in my class before. So hopefully we'll have some great ideas that maybe you can use in class. And Wu says, I've had very nice classes by showing grammar structures with comics. Awesome. So very cool.
Awesome.
Lots of great ideas and experiences out there. Thanks for sharing, everybody.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's really important for us to realize that so many people have so many different experiences. And at the same time, almost all of us have had an experience with comics, whether it's just a comic strip, or if it's a whole comic book, or if it's multiple times over our lifetimes. And this is a chance for us to use that knowledge to help us out. So we go on to the next slide. let's talk a little bit about how comic books work. And that's where, if you recall, if you were an attendant at the last webinar, it was all about reading comics, right? And that covered a lot of the anatomy of a comic, how comic books function and work. So we're just going to do a quick overview of that to catch some people up to speed, or or to refresh your memory if you were here last time. So on the next slide, we talk about how these are the basic components of every comic: panels, pictures, word balloons, thought bubbles, captions, right? Those are the parts that make up any comic, or almost any comic. And the goal of a creator is pretty challenging, because what you got to do is create a relationship between all of those elements, so that makes a story that makes sense to your reader, that tells the story of your character going through their emotions or their journey. Whatever is happening becomes completely evident to your reader. And that can be really challenging the first time you start messing around with comics. But at the same time, because little kids make comics all the time by just doing a drawing and then having a little word balloon of what that character's saying, what that drawing is saying, we have a familiarity with that type of storytelling. We just haven't thought about it as a tool for learning language or solving problems. So if we go on to the next slide here, we understand that the magic of comics is in the gutters. It's in the space in between the panels. And at the next slide, we have a really good example of that.
So you mean there's that, you can see, everybody, can you go back one more time? You can see that arrow right there that says the gutter. So the gutter is that white space in
right.
the panels, or which are the boxes for the screens. So anyways, continue. Just wanted to make sure to point that out.
No, good. Thank you. That's why you're here, Kate. For a million other reasons, but there's another good reason right there. So on our next slide, we actually see how that gutter works, right? So our imagination fills in the spaces in between the panel on the left and the panel on the right. So for example, here we've got this young man running, and for some reason he gets very old in the next panel, and he doesn't know why. And neither does the monster behind. But we see all this evidence that time has passed, right? And their imagination has to guess what happened. What happened between the panel on the left and the panel on the right? And our minds can fill that in with anything. But that's really how comics work. When the storytelling is really good, our brains just know what happens between one panel and the next. And if we go to the next slide here, we realize this is how comics have worked forever. And we have examples of comics going all the way back to prehistoric cave drawings, and then Egyptian hieroglyphics, and then tribal paintings on ceramics, and then tapestries in medieval times, and then in our newspaper strips and in our comic books. All of these are examples of comics. They're all working on the same principles. The idea of an image, sometimes paired with a word, usually paired with a word and language, that then tells a story or shares information with space in between each that signifies time or distance, right? And it happens all the time. So if we go to our next slide, we're going to get into part 3 about how to make comics. And I've got a question for you folks. When you think about what we've talked about so far about comics and making comics, in what ways might your students have difficulty creating comics?
Great question. What might be a difficult aspect of creating comics for your students? What do you think? We actually already have a comment from Bulbul who says, if I can't draw well, how can I create a comic book? And I think that points to a lot of what people might be thinking about creating comics. And so Kauser agrees that the drawing part might be difficult. Excellent. What else do you think, everybody? What other challenges might there be in creating comics? Let's see. I don't have much experience.
Yeah, a lot of people get worried about that.
Yeah, so maybe Cami says I don't have much experience with comics. So maybe that would be a challenge because the teacher wants to feel more secure with this before she introduces it to her class.
Right.
A lot of people saying that it takes a lot of time or that the drawing part might be difficult. Lashmi says organizing ideas might be difficult for students. If they're not used to reading.
That's a really great point. Organizing ideas. That can be really difficult.
Mm-hmm. Lack of vocab, difficulty making the theme or the story from Hina. Great, so wonderful ideas, everybody. Thanks for sharing.
Right, and if you're tuning in, I've thought about a lot of those concerns that you might have, and I think you're going to be happy to see what's coming up here in the next few slides.
Awesome.
If we go right to the next slide, right? These are 3 questions I hear all the time. Should I start with the art, or should I start with the words, or should I start with coming up with a story? And the reality is, it doesn't matter where you start. You can start with any of those. In fact, professional comic book artists and creators, they start at all different places. Some of them start with just a story, and then after they come up with the story, then they draw all the pictures, and then they write all the words. That was actually how some of the first superhero comics were made. Now there's a lot more creators who write the entire story first, all the words, all the dialogue, and then they do the art. And there's even some who work back and forth and start with the story a little bit, and then they make some words, and then they add some dialogue, and then they do some art. It doesn't matter where your students start. What matters is that they're able to express their ideas. And if we go on to our next slide, it just reinforces that idea that any way your students make comics is the right way to make comics. And I've got a strategy for you that I think several of you folks are going to find very doable, and it's going to help relieve you of some of those worries about not being able to create art. And that's the strategy that I call the word balloon rearrange. And this is what you're looking at right now is an example of what you're about to see in just a few minutes. It's like the finished work, but I'm going to show you how to create a comic that uses magazine images and uses cutout pieces of paper in order to tell a story really, really quickly without any art skills whatsoever.
Cool. Yeah, let me make one comment from Isa before we keep going on this one, which I think is interesting. She says,
yeah,
which you're sort of addressing. So not all students are good at drawing, which we talked about a little bit. There might be students who are not interested in comics. So, so they also need to learn how to write the story. What do you think for this person? What do you think might be a good way to overcome some of these issues that she's discussing?
So what I would say for that situation with those students is I would suggest trying to focus on the storytelling and presenting those ideas. And what you could potentially do is say, hey, why don't you write the story, and then this other student who really loves doing the art will illustrate it.
Great idea.
And then you've actually created an actual comic book studio like in your classroom.
Yeah.
And that's how most comic books are created. Most comics are created by a writer and an artist, not by one person doing them all.
Awesome. Yeah, and that's a really great way for students to develop their collaboration skills too, and working in groups and pairs.
Oh, absolutely, right?
Awesome.
Absolutely. A great way for collaboration, a great opportunity to experiment with something that you're not comfortable with by focusing on your strengths, right? And then experimenting with that part of it that you're not super strong with.
Definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's go through the steps here of word balloon rearrange, and let's see how you could actually go about making a comic using just some parts and pieces of things that are laying around your classroom. So step 1 is take any piece of paper. I happen to use a piece of cardstock I happen to have available to me, and you cut out a bunch of word balloons and thought bubbles and caption shapes, and just create a variety. You don't have to make a lot, just make a few. And then in step 2, what you're going to do is you're going to go digging into magazines or pictures you print from the internet. I happen to find magazines and newspapers around often, and find some pictures you want to use for your characters and cut those out. And then in step 3, you're going to just arrange those word balloons and thought bubbles that you cut out, and you're going to just arrange those around your photos as though those are the dialogue spaces for your characters. And you can see in the example I've given you here, like I thought I was going to have the character on the left thinking, and then the character in the middle was going to say something, and then the character on the right was going to say something. But I started changing the story in my head as I was thinking it through, and I decided to rearrange it. And with something like this, you can do that really easily without needing to find new materials. You've got it all there ready for you. So you arrange the shapes, and then in step 4, you add dialogue and thoughts and narration. So there on the right, you can see where I went through and I numbered the bubbles, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then I wrote the dialogue of what's being said between those characters, right? Just on a separate piece of paper. That way I can reuse all the materials. I don't have to make new bubbles later. Students could put their bubbles in a little envelope. They could put their pictures in an envelope and keep it somewhere safe. You could have a set in your classroom or in your learning space where that's the only time that you see it and use it. And just take them out when you want them, but you could pre-make them. Because I know a lot of folks don't have a lot of time in the classroom, right? And it can feel like, whoa, comics take a long time to make. But if you already have the materials ready, then it's easy to hand them to a student. If you have digital tools available to you, I made a quick one on the left, just using pictures from a free-to-use website called Unsplash, where all the pictures are free and available to you. And I used these 2 photos I found there, featuring an old man saying, "May I please have 1 large coffee with sugar?" And then I have the man at the coffee store saying, "How do I tell him we're out of sugar?" Like he's not sure what to do. And the old man looks like he'd be very upset if he found this out. So you can create these quick little stories using the tools that are available to you without having any art skills at all. And believe me, my cutting skills are not super great. So as evident by our pictures here, but the idea got across. And that's what I really want people to see. It's about the ideas. It's not about the art.
Great. A lot of people say they love this idea. Great idea. Easy way to create comics and stuff like that. So very nice. Thanks, Dan. This is a great idea. I'm so thrilled people are liking it, because I got really excited when I was making it, right? And that concern about materials, I said it a couple moments ago, but everything you're seeing that I made today is made out of reused stuff. It's all made out of scrap paper. It's all made out of things I found laying around. I didn't go out and buy anything new for any of this. I used an old magazine that I had. I used a backing board from one of my comic books. Sometimes when you buy comic books in a comic book store here in the States, you'll find a little piece of cardboard in behind your comic to keep it flat. So I just took one out of there and cut that up. And you can reuse everything. Perfect.
So another question for you folks is, speaking of tools and materials, what tools and materials are available to your students for making comics?
Yeah, what do you think? So Dan has shared with us some ways that he uses paper and magazines to have introduced comics to his students. What other materials do you have available that you could use to create comics with your students? It could be really simple things. It could be really complex things. What do you have? Let's see, Hina says newspaper. Kausar says magazine. What other tools do you have? Paper, pencils, colors, and web apps from Nahir. Thanks for sharing. Newspaper from Gigi. Scissors from Roberto. Magazine and newspapers. Even you could use an old comic book from Tausa. Good idea.
Absolutely. A great idea is to use old comics and then take little pieces of paper and cut them out and cover the word balloons and add your own dialogue. It's a great way to practice making comics.
Miliani says to make a family comic That's a great idea. Maybe you use family photos or something. Awesome.
Oh, great idea. Yeah, using your own photography is even better than using photos you find. I always tell my students that. Like, it's great to find something, it's even better to make something. And you know, if you make it yourself, then you can use it however you want.
That's true. Yeah.
If we go on to our next, oh, sorry, go ahead, Kate.
No, just trying to say everybody has really great ideas. Thanks, everyone.
These are great ideas. And on our next slide, we just see an example of the different materials you can use. You know, any sort of art supplies. You can paint comics. You can color comics with crayons. You can use markers. You can use pencils. Anything that you want for a writing utensil or a painting utensil. You can also use digital tools. There are a lot of apps for making comics. There are a lot of apps that aren't really for making comics, but they're for making like little captions on photos and such, and you can make comics out of those. And then you can always make things out of found materials, like those objects that I was using earlier, but you can make comics out of old cardboard boxes, out of old wrapping. You can make out of old newspapers, anything that you find that you can draw on, you can make into a comic. And I even had a student who used to use an old phone. She loved to make comics on her phone, but her phone wasn't a smartphone. It didn't let her like mark things up and draw things on the touchscreen. All it could do was text. And so what she did is she made comic book characters out of just the symbols you can find on a phone. And she'd make these elaborate stories all out of these text-based characters. They were really, really cool.
Nice. Let's see, we have a good question from Bilbo, who says, do you have any recommendations for software for drawing images? Anything for a newbie that you would recommend?
So one of my favorite things to use for drawing is a website called sketch.io or Sketchio, and it's free. And it's like a digital art pad right online. And for a newbie, it's great for drawing. And you can load pictures into it and draw right on top of the pictures. And it works really, really well. And I recommend it to all my students that I work with here at school. And it works on any type of device, which is one of the other reasons I like to use it. So we don't run into problems if a student doesn't have the right type of phone or the right type of computer. I really like sketch.io.
Cool.
I think they also have an app that you can download. But I usually just use it through my browser because at our school, it's really hard to load apps onto our machines. So we have to be really careful about that. So I try to find everything I can digitally. I try to find everything I can that's free, fair to use, and that students aren't going to run into problems trying to access.
Wonderful. Great.
So before we go into our big section 4 here full of all sorts of strategies for you to use, let's do a little inventory. What are some English skills you could practice by making comics?
Great. What do you think? So Amin actually had a similar question. She was asking, can I teach grammar by using comics? And I would love to hear from our audience about that question too. But what are some English skills you could practice by making comics? What do you think? HP says speaking skills. Great. Maybe the students are working together to create a dialogue and then they share the dialogue out loud that they've created. Sentence writing, writing skills from Ma Jabin. Literature, nice one, from Maria Chor. You could teach writing, grammar, and vocabulary. So I think the answer to the question from Ahmad is, or to the question we had before is that yes, you can teach grammar through comics.
Oh, absolutely.
Great. Character development or brainstorming characters.
Humor. I saw that.
Oh, nice.
Show
Oh,
up.
yeah.
It's a great. Comics are great for exploring humor and for comparing like what different people find funny. It's a great way to explore like what makes something funny, what makes something not funny, what makes something like that we think is going to be funny, but is actually harmful or hurtful.
Yeah.
And right, it's a great safe way to do that.
Wonderful. Yeah, great ideas, everybody. Sounds like we can absolutely practice English skills by using comics, is what it sounds like.
Absolutely. English skills and really any skills. Comics are useful no matter what you're teaching. So let's take a look at 3 strategies that we could use to help us think with comics and help us apply our English skills to also doing some critical thinking and some deeper thinking experiences. So here's three ways that you could use comics. 1, you could use it to do some comparison work and compare 2 experiences. You could also use comics to help connect the language your students are learning to their daily lives. And then finally, you could also use comics to help them work on their decision-making skills. So the first one we're going to look at is this idea of comparison and comparing 2 experiences. And one thing I want you to think about, and I'd like some ideas on. Oh, I think we skipped a slide. There we go. Is how might students show their understanding of American culture by making comics?
Great. So what do you think, everybody? In our English language classrooms, often we are sharing ideas about American culture as well as we are teaching English. So what are some ways that you can think of that comics might help enhance this process for your students? How could you ask your students to show what they know about American culture by using comics? What do you think? Let's see, they can collect ideas from American culture to talk about in the comics. Very nice, from Tausif. Let's see, they can be used to teach idioms from Irum. Excellent idea.
Great idea, fantastic idea.
You could, Rusana says you can make stories using American culture elements. Nice idea. Comparing American habits with their own, from Mahmoud. I wonder if he already has heard this webinar before. Comparing American habits with their own. Let's see, culture, Amjad says culture is expressed through language, so it kind of goes hand in hand if you're using English for comics to kind of explore American culture. And HP says they can depict comics about their cultural practices. Great idea.
These are excellent. Like, all great ideas, right? So I've got an example to show you folks. I'll take you through my process of creating one. And I made this one in about 15 minutes. So if you get a sense of like, oh, this seems like it's going to take a long time, the one you're about to see took about 15 minutes from beginning to end. So in the next slide, you're going to see that one of the ways you can do this is compare, one of your daily routines to an American student's daily routine, right? And I've got the finished work here. This is my finished piece, but I want to show you the steps that I went through to create these comparisons of American breakfast eating routines to Thai breakfast eating routines. So if you go to the next slide here, I made a list of routines. And so I thought of morning routines and afternoon routines and evening routines, and I just started listing them. And you can see where for the morning, I listed breakfast and getting dressed and washing and going to work. And the afternoon was lunch and meetings. And the evening is dinner and checking social media and reading. And so you got to kind of narrow those down, like what's one that you find interesting, right? And if you go to the next slide, like I love breakfast. So I tuned in on breakfast. And it's very strange. You're going to see in the next slide that I love breakfast so much because my breakfast is very simple, but I enjoy it a great deal. So on the next slide, you can see where I started. I drew a 1-page comic about my breakfast, which is I make breakfast in my kitchen. I get my bread out of my refrigerator so it lasts longer. I put 2 slices of bread into my toaster. I cover it in peanut butter and I drive it. I eat it while I drive to work. And that's what I do for breakfast every morning, right? But I know that that's my experience and I wanted to compare that experience to someone else. So I did a little research, and on the next slide, we're going to see that after I did some research, I learned about Thai culture. And I made a little comic about one of my friends who lives in Thailand, and he has a different breakfast. He walks to work every morning. I drive, he walks. He almost buys the same thing every morning, which is this rice and egg and chicken and red pepper little dish of deliciousness. And he gets the same thing. He gets the same thing almost every day. He changes up what he adds to it sometimes. But the way that I could really start thinking about the differences was by putting our two comics side by side. So if you look on the next slide here, we can see like exactly the difference between the left and the right, right? And we can see that there's the things that I do in the morning and the things that the other folks do in the morning.
Very cool. Yeah, lots of people saying how much they like this idea. Wonderful idea. Maria, great idea. Tausif, good. You have a healthy breakfast, sir, says Ahmad. So really great. And I think this is a great way to compare one aspect of two different cultures. Do you think, Dan, that you could do other aspects as well of culture?
Oh, absolutely. You could pick anything. I think I saw someone mention in the chat, but I know it got mentioned earlier. It's a great opportunity to look at like different ways you dress, different modes of fashion. It's also a great way to talk about different beliefs or different habits that we have, different rituals that we have in our lives. It's a fantastic way to look at those things. And then you can use some of the symbolism associated with those rituals to help us really see how they're dissimilar, but also how they're similar.
Absolutely. And Antonio says this is helping our students develop critical thinking. Excellent. And Diana Lopez said they can even create stories about friends from two different countries, like the US and Peru or something like that. That's a great idea.
Absolutely. And after you make these, a lot of folks talk about, well, where am I going to get comics that I can use to talk about culture? Well, after they make these, you could keep them. You can make copies of them, or you could keep them in the room and use them as your texts. And then they're student-made comics, right? And then you know exactly what your texts are. You know they have the language skills in them demonstrated that you're looking for. And you know they're going to be written at the level of your students as well if you use them with other students.
Absolutely.
So
we had a comment earlier. Yeah, we had a comment earlier from a participant who said that you could use this with different levels, because maybe some students are going to draw more pictures and have just a few vocabulary words, and others have more detailed captions and word balloons and thought bubbles because maybe their language is a little bit more developed. So,
absolutely. Oh, and when we talked about collaborating earlier, it's also an opportunity for co-learning, because you could have one of your higher level writing or vocabulary students come in and write the words on top of the pictures, right? And then they're having a conversation about why did you write this? What is that word? What's the word for this? And what's the word for that? And then they're working together, and they're not just collaborating on the creating of something, but they're also collaborating on the learning of the language and those skills. And just as a quick note, we were talking about materials earlier. This is just little pieces of notebook paper, right? Again, like I draw right on, I don't use the lines. I just ignore the lines, use whatever you have.
Awesome. We had a couple comments or sort of questions from Ahmed and Yen about how much time does this take? Is it too time consuming? Is it easy to manage class time in this type of activity?
So my classes are typically pretty long as a class period, but because I work with adolescent students, they're usually ages 14 through 17 or 18. They have to have things broken up a lot or they get really bored. So I design all of my learning experiences around 30 to 40 minute chunks. So if you have a class that's about 40 minutes long or 30 minutes long, by just using some of these creative constraints that we've talked about, these boundaries like It needs to be about a morning routine, right? Well, then they're not spending 20 minutes thinking about, well, which routine should I focus on? You said, nope, it's just about the morning. Let's narrow it down. And then I want you to compare two experiences between mornings. That helps to narrow down the wide range of topics they might be talking about. And then the other piece is just keep reminding them that the art can be very simple. These are boxes with circles and quick lines. Something I do with my students to begin with, usually fairly early in my classes, is I teach them how to doodle. And I teach them to doodle quickly and to not worry about it looking like any particular thing other than what you need it to look like. So the conversation I have with them all the time is, how can you use the most simple shapes to get the most meaning? And you can see that my faces there are just rectangles with short little curved lines and circles, right? And the bread is a piece of art. It really is. It's beautiful. I know. But it's not. It's just it looks like bread. It feels like bread. And my toaster is like kind of goofy looking, and that's okay. Like, it's all right as long as you get the idea across.
Great. Nahir says students, when they're interacting in English, they have to also talk about their own culture and the target culture. So this is a really great activity for that. So I think.
Oh, excellent! I'm glad to hear that.
Yes.
I'm so thrilled that people are making connections between the thinking. Like, I really appreciate that.
Awesome.
So let's go on to the next one. I almost forgot that I'm the one who's supposed to be like running the show here. I got so caught up in reading the comments. I'm loving this.
Yeah.
So the next question is, how might students create comics to connect their new English skills to their everyday lives?
Great. Very good question. Let's hear from you, everybody. How do you think you could use comics in your classroom to help students connect English to their daily lives? What are some ideas that you have for maybe topics or activities that you could do with comics that would help your students make that connection? Let's see. Brian says they can make a comic strip journal. Hina says you could.
Oh, I love that.
Hina says you could use it as a warm-up. They could do it about their daily routines from Deepak.
Yes.
What Laura says, when they learn something new, they can make comics as like a review. That's awesome. Nahir says they can talk about their families. Awesome, great idea. Let's see.
I love these. These are all great ideas.
These are all really great. Oh, writing about their new experiences, future plans, and events from Deepak. Great ideas, everybody.
Oh, these are all great. On the next slide, I'm going to show you an example of how you might be able to connect your vocab lesson to your students' experiences in their day-to-day. Because you might ask them to create a story that shows how they're going to put that language to use and explain it. That also helps them reinforce their understanding of that language. If you challenge them to identify a way in which they would use it, and then they can kind of turn that into an imaginary story, into, well, what if I used it this way? Oh, now I can actually make that real. I have thought about what that would look like and what that experience would be. And I'll walk you really quickly through what I created here. If you'll notice, it's also using the same piece of cardstock that I made my thought bubbles out of. I cut it out, and then I said, you know what? I can just draw my comic right on this. It's sitting right here. So why use another piece of paper?
Nice.
So on the next slide, you'll see the vocab that I worked with was the language of directions. And here you can see the types of doodles that I like to do and teach students to use to help them understand concepts by just having a visual that goes along with the new words. And so right, left, straight, go, about, where. Okay? And on the next slide, you're going to see I kind of imagined, I had to do a little imagining here, and I imagined that a student would be thinking about, oh, well, where do I work? Well, I might use my language of directions in my job. And in this case, I thought of a student who works for a river rafting company. And then on the next slide, you're going to see all the panels, right? I asked them to create a one-page comic that shows them using their new vocabulary. So today we learned about directions. We learned right, left, straight, go, about, and where. Now, I work for a river rafting company. Lots of American tourists come here. I used to have to draw directions and maps, but now I can say them. And, you know, you go about 5 kilometers and then turn right and then go about 2 kilometers and then launches on the left. So it's just a little context, an example of where a student in a one-page comic could explain exactly how they're going to put the language skills you've been working on during that lesson or during that unit of time, how they're going to put it into work.
Awesome. And I think this is a great reflection piece as well, because the student can understand where they started in this language learning process and where they are now. At first, they had to draw directions for the tourists that came in, but now they can actually explain with the new direction words that they learned. So this is
right.
Awesome. Great idea. Let me just share a couple of other really great ideas, if you don't mind, Dan, from our participants.
Oh, by all means. Everyone else's ideas are like 100 times better than mine. So I love it. I'm going to use all of these that I'm reading.
Let's see. Students could write their dreams for the future. So they could maybe use this similar format here.
Yes.
Yeah, that one's from Diana.
That's a great idea. I love that one.
Antonio says the students could act out the comics after making the comics, and that would help them practice their speaking skills.
Oh, that's fantastic. I'm also a theater teacher. So I love that connection too.
Let's see. They could translate a literary short story to a comic form, like The Telltale Heart from Antonio also.
Yes.
Wow, good one.
Wow. Great idea.
Unbelievable. And we'll just do.
That might take you more than 40 minutes.
I might take, yeah. Let's see. They could use this to show their understanding of new vocabulary by describing situations in their lives. So great idea. Awesome, everybody.
Yeah, I love it. I love that. I love making those connections. So many times my students ask me, why are we learning this? And one of the ways that I have found to keep that question from popping up as often is to make that just part of the learning experience anyway. I let them know right up front, we're going to be exploring why we need to know this knowledge and how we're going to use it, and then we use it in that way. So this is something, you know, that's just a kind of a general suggestion for teachers as you're designing your curriculum and you're deciding what you're going to do with your students for activities and the learning and the sequencing, is immediately work that in. Like, all right, here we go. This is how we're going to use it. So we've got one more strategy for you here. And that's going to be on the next slide. Okay. And this next one is about making choices and making decisions. Okay. And we're going to go through this one really quickly to make sure that we have time for the kind of the wrap up here. But one of the ways that you can work with students is to ask them to predict possible outcomes when they're making a decision, because decision making is a really important critical creativity experience. Critical creativity. I'm sorry, I misspoke there. Critical thinking experience. I wrote a book about critical creativity, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about critical thinking. But making decisions is one of those things where you have to consider a lot of different variables and consider a lot of different circumstances and situations. And it can be really hard for students, especially if they don't have the language for it. So having them predict possible outcomes using new language is a fantastic way to explore both their decision-making process and also their new vocabulary and their new grammatical skills. So here we see a comic with someone trying to decide, after I've graduated from university, where am I going to work? What should I do? Choice one is working close to home. So I'm 10 minutes from home and I can walk there. That's a benefit, but the harm is my mother and father want me to find my own path. They don't want me in the house anymore. And so that's option one. So choice number two might be, well, I can work in the next town over, because there are more jobs there and I might make more money. But at the same time, a harm might be, I don't know anybody there. I don't know where I would live. It might cost more to live there. I don't know. So after you have them make a comic that shows the pluses and the minuses, the benefits and the harms, then you do a final caption. If we go to the next slide here, and we'll jump one more slide here in the interest of time. There we go. So then you do a final caption that says, so this is my choice. I'll work close to home so that I can save enough money to move to the next town, right? So then they're making a decision based on weighing all the possibilities.
Awesome.
Right? It's really important to have that last piece. So it's not just where they're just making those comparisons, but then they make their decision and they give their reason why. And I'm constantly having that conversation with my students too. Why did you make the decision you made? What was your reasoning behind that? And when they articulate that, that can be a really powerful way for them to realize that they've, what they've learned or what they know, or they might even realize they know more than they realized, right? Than they thought. They actually have a lot more knowledge than they initially believed when they went into the experience, right?
Definitely. Deepak says this is really going to help their critical thinking, making them creative and good decision makers. And thanks for that comment, Deepak. And Majabeen
Thank you, Deepak. I sure hope so.
Yeah. And Majabeen says prediction can help students in goal setting as well, which I think is sort of tied to decision making. Mm-hmm. Awesome.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So if we go to our next slide here,
Mm-hmm.
and we'll jump one more. Okay. What subjects or topics might your students make comics about?
Yeah, so we've explored a lot of great ideas and activities and ways to develop critical thinking. Maybe think of those as frameworks for topics that your students might make comics about. What could they make a comic about that might help with their critical thinking skills or their problem-solving skills? What topics might help with their language development skills? What do you think? Hina says science. Always a good one, yes. Maybe they could...
Oh, nice, yes.
Someone from our previous session said science experiment, so maybe they could show the steps of that or something like that. That's a great idea.
And that's something I love doing, like making a hypothesis, right? You do a one comic where you guess what's going to happen, and then you do the comic of what actually happened, right? And it's a great way to practice science.
Good. Muhazir says history, so maybe an important event in history, what happened in that event. World affairs, Kausar, excellent idea.
Right.
Carla says that she carries out comics contests, so that's a great idea as well.
Great idea. Contests are a great way.
Yeah, Arno says to compare weekday routines or weekend events. Social problems from Ruzana, good one.
Excellent. So we've got a few questions for people to think about afterwards, after you walk away from our session today. So how might you use your experiences with comic books in your teaching? How might you provide opportunities for students to practice both writing and drawing comics? And finally, how might you add a comic book creating activity or assessment to one of your current lessons, as opposed to having to make something brand new that never existed before? How could you just work one of these ideas into something that you already feel pretty good about, but might just make the rest of your experience even better?
Yeah, those are great. Really good questions to consider as you move forward today through your day and your week. And even you can take a look at these questions and continue to think about them by finding our slides on the American English website and our American English webinar Ning, our online community.
That's awesome. So 3 big points I want to make before I leave you for the rest of the day, and for you to go and experience the rest of your days and the days into the future. Okay. 3 big points. 1, creating comics challenges students to think in completely different ways that they typically don't get an opportunity to. 2, there are many ways to practice English language skills through creating comics. There isn't just one right way to do it. And 3, finally, there are many, many ways to create comics, and they are all correct. Every single one of them. Every way that you can think of to make a comic is the right way to make a comic.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dan. I think we all got so many really wonderful creative ideas from your presentation today. Really love those examples of how we can use not just a few, not even that many resources to create really great activities for our students, and that our students can use to create really great material for their learning as well. So thank you so much for a great presentation today.
You're hearing all the bells. You're hearing what the end of a day sounds like here in the Western foothills of Maine. But what I really wanted to thank all the participants, because those ideas that we saw, and Kate, the ones you were reading from Facebook Live, and just so many good ones. And I think if someone was looking to plan their next 3 weeks of lessons, you could just go through here and it would all be done.
Absolutely.
You would have everything that right in front of you.
Definitely. And we're seeing so many great comments from our participants thanking you, Dan, for that wonderful presentation. But we'd of course like to thank you, our audience, for all of your amazing ideas today. As Dan mentioned before, I think he and I both learned a lot of great new activities that could be used. So thank you for your wonderful participation, and we hope that you can continue the conversation on social media and on our Ning and with your colleagues and friends where you are. So thanks everybody for joining us.